In 1891, James Naismith nailed a peach basket to a wall in Massachusetts and created one of the greatest games in history, basketball, with no idea what this new sport would eventually become. Basketball grew, and in 1949, the two existing basketball leagues of the time merged into one, creating the NBA. Over the last 70 years, basketball has had some truly great eras and players. The 60s, with the superhuman Wilt Chamberlain and the ultimate winner Bill Russell. The 80s, with the rivalry of Magic and Bird. The 90s, when Michael Jordan became, and still is for many, including myself, the greatest player in NBA history. The 2000s, when greats like Kobe Bryant, Tim Duncan, and Shaquille O'Neal won most of their titles and became legendary. And most recently, the 2010s, when three-pointers began to completely change the way the game is played, and LeBron James became a worthy rival to Michael Jordan for the title of the GOAT. Now we're entering the 2020s, after possibly the strangest year the NBA has ever seen, and I want to look back at these decades and determine which one was really the best, which era of basketball was truly the greatest in NBA history. The 1980s were the greatest decade in NBA history. Or were they? I don't actually know, so let's start talking about it. I almost turned this into a weird Good Mythical Morning intro. But hey, it's Mike the NBA guy, and obviously the 80s are the decade I will be talking about today. If you haven't checked out my 60s video, please go and do so. It doesn't really affect this video in any way. It's not like this is a sequel and you need to have watched it, but I would really appreciate it. But anyway, enough blabbering, I'm going to get right into this. So, in the video about the 60s, I mentioned how that was kind of the beginning of the NBA's popularity. Alright, before the 60s, nobody gave a shit about watching basketball, and there's a variety of reasons for it. First of all, I think a lot of people just didn't know about the sport and didn't give a shit. A lot of people didn't have TVs. But one of the main reasons is that there was no entertainment, and the 60s brought that, at least to some extent. You had the super team Celtics, who were incredible every single year, and you also had these phenomenal, superstar, all-time great players. Players who would still be great today. Alright, we are talking about Wilt Chamberlain, with his ridiculous 50-point seasons. 50-point, 25-rebound seasons, alright? The 100-point game. Absolutely iconic. Jerry West and his incredible finals performances. Elgin Baylor is another one. Another highlight machine, okay? Or at least they would have been if highlights were around back then. So if the 60s kind of laid the groundwork for the NBA becoming popular, the 80s is where it exploded, alright? The 1980s are when the NBA really became a worldwide sport. And it wouldn't quite reach its peak until the 90s, and I would say it's pretty much stayed there until today. But the 80s was really the build-up ramp to the juggernaut the NBA would become in the 90s. And just because it still wasn't quite at peak popularity, that is not a knock on the 80s, okay? The 80s was huge for the NBA. The amount of views the 80s got compared to the 70s and the 60s, astronomical increases. And while there are many reasons this happened, there are two players we have to thank for this more than anyone else. Alright, two players who we arguably have to thank more than any other players in NBA history for the sport's popularity. Alright, the only player I think is comparable is Michael Jordan. And those two players are obviously Magic Johnson and Larry Bird. Fucking incredible legends. Okay? And again, you see shit today. You still see it. They played against weak competition, alright? You see stuff all the time about Larry Bird being an unathletic white guy and he wouldn't survive in today's NBA. And, Magic Johnson couldn't shoot, he wouldn't survive in today's NBA. Absolutely ridiculous, okay? If you don't have these two players in your top 10, you are a fucking clown. Alright, these are incredible players, and they played on two teams who both have an argument for being the greatest teams of all time. Alright, the 80s Lakers, which kind of carried throughout the decades, and the 80s Celtics, who specifically peaked in 1986. Alright, so starting the decade off, Actually, prior to the decade, these players' hype built up in 1979 when they played in college, which is still the most, I believe, is still the most watched college game of all time. All right, that game got more views than most finals games these days. It is insane how popular these two players were even before coming into the league. 1980, it's a very open league, but not in a great way. Okay, there's just not a real it factor. You know, there's not that incredible talent. Kareem Abdul-Jabbar was amazing, but he wasn't exactly the most popular player in the world. All right. He had some media issues, and it's not something I hold against Kareem at all, because he was a very outspoken advocate for black rights and civil rights, and the dude was huge for civil rights. All right, he wasn't quite Bill Russell, but he was very important for that. However, it made him rather unpopular, and it's very unfortunate looking back, but he was just known as a guy who was very unpleasant to deal with in the media, and not a dude who necessarily drew crowds. And on top of that, his game wasn't super flashy. The man had finesse, but he hung out in the post. He wasn't crazy flashy or anything. Magic Johnson and Larry Bird changed that. All right, let's start with Magic Johnson. This dude came in, and Magic Johnson had, in his rookie year, what I would consider the greatest game in NBA history, the greatest single game in NBA history. All right? Not necessarily the best, but the greatest. And that is Game 6 against the Philadelphia 76ers when he beat them in the conference finals. When Kareem went down and Magic had, I believe the stat line was 42 points, 15 rebounds, and 7 assists. He played center. He played every position on the floor, in fact, in that finals. But he replaced the best player in the world at the time, Kareem, at center on his team as a rookie. And he led the Lakers to the championship that game. Absolutely phenomenal game. I'm not going to tell you you're wrong if you don't think it's the greatest game in NBA history. But in my opinion, when you look at storyline, with the fact that he was the rookie, you look at the fact that this is the finals, you look at the fact that he won the championship, the only possible way this game could have been greater is if it was a Game 7 instead of a Game 6. Okay, that is the only possible way this could have been more of a storybook beginning to Magic's career. Fucking incredible. And then the next year, Larry Bird won the title with the Boston Celtics, and this is kind of how it would go. All right, the Lakers managed to make the finals 9 times during the 80s. The Celtics managed to make the finals 5 times during the 80s, and combined, these two teams won 8 of the titles during that decade. All right, they were amazing. The Lakers, with Magic and Kareem and eventually James Worthy, they were called the Showtime Lakers because they were the NBA's first real crowd-drawing, incredible super team, okay? You look at the Warriors these days, and people don't like super teams these days, and as a hardcore fan, completely dislike super teams, all right, because they're not fun, in my opinion, to watch. But back in the day, and if you look at casual fans, even today, okay, the Warriors are super popular because casual fans love to watch these amazing teams go out and kick ass. And back in the day, you had the Showtime Lakers, were the epitome of this, all right? And they did it great because they were flashy. Magic was the greatest passer in NBA history, no question in my mind. You had Kareem scoring in the post. James Worthy kind of did it all. They had a lot of other great players on the team. They were Los Angeles. This was when Los Angeles became the center city. There are some New York Knicks fans who will try to convince you that New York is the greatest basketball city. It's not. I would say it's not even close. But even at pure media attention for basketball, I still think it really is LA. And there's no real question in my mind that LA is the king of basketball. All right? On the other side of the country, you had the Boston Celtics. Larry Bird, in my opinion, the best player of the 1980s. If we're looking at the decade as a whole, dude was ridiculous. Won 3 straight MVPs in 84, 85, and 86. Ridiculous. Okay? This man could not be stopped in his prime. It is so sad that Magic and Bird had injuries or circumstances that prevented them from reaching their, or not from reaching their peaks, but from having longer primes going into the late 90s. All right? that Larry Bird and Magic Johnson could both have cases for being the GOAT if neither of them had to retire early due to unfortunate circumstances. These two players were so fucking good, and I cannot believe there are people these days who really think that Larry Bird would not be able to play in the modern NBA. This man would be better than Kevin Durant today. I fully believe that. Alright? We're talking about the greatest shooter of the 80s. He would shoot way more today. This man was an insanely hard worker. He played defense, okay? He was not insanely athletic, but he was, in my opinion, and this is purely from watching film, the second smartest player in NBA history, only behind LeBron. And when I say smartest, I mean basketball IQ. Okay, I'm not talking about like who would get their degree from Harvard. Basketball IQ, Larry Bird is the best in NBA history, second only to LeBron James. This dude was ridiculous. He was a fantastic passer, fantastic scorer, great rebounder for his size. He was good on defense, playing team defense specifically, even if he wasn't like earth-shattering one-on-one. He was insanely clutch, okay? He was up there with Jerry West and Michael Jordan for the most clutch players in NBA history. Okay, if you're looking at the top 5, I've definitely got Larry Bird in there, and if you don't, you need to watch some fucking film, because the dude was absurdly clutch. He is the greatest trash talker in NBA history. Okay? You would not want to play Larry Bird, because not only would he smoke your ass for 30, he would also talk shit the entire time while he did it. People say Kevin Garnett is the greatest trash talker in NBA history. He's not. Kevin Garnett is the biggest asshole in NBA history. There's a difference. There is a difference between pure, good trash talk and just being a piece of shit. Making fun of someone's dead mother on Mother's Day, like Kevin Garnett did to Tim Duncan, that's not trash talk. That's being a piece of human shit. Okay? Good trash talk is related to the court. Alright? It's related to basketball. It doesn't get super crazy personal like that. It doesn't relate to nothing that has to do with basketball. Good trash talk is when Larry Bird sat there and said, I'm going to hit this game winner in your fucking face. He faked the dude, hit him in the butt with the basketball, and then dropped the fucking game winner, okay? That is amazing trash talk. Dude's the greatest trash talker in NBA history. No question, in my opinion. End of discussion. Ridiculous. Gotta take a drink of water for a second. Alright, what else? The Sixers super team in 1983. Another team that has a case for the greatest team of all time. In my opinion, it is the greatest team to only win one championship. Alright? This team almost swept the entire playoffs. They only lost one game. They were absurd. Moses Malone was the MVP. In my opinion, one of the most underrated players in NBA history. I believe he is the 6th best center in NBA history. And it really hurts that the center position throughout NBA history is just, I'm saying NBA history too many times, but the center position is ridiculously stacked. Okay, you got guys like Wilt, Russell, Hakeem, Shaq, forgetting someone really obvious, Kareem, duh. Okay, these guys were amazing, and Moses Malone just wasn't quite as good as they were, but the dude was fucking ridiculous, alright? Maybe the greatest offensive rebounder of all time. The only competitor I could see would be probably David Robinson. I'm sorry, that's not true. Would be Dennis Rodman. That's it, Dennis Rodman. I don't know why I forgot his name. Anyway, I'm getting off topic here, though. Moses Malone was fucking ridiculous. Julius Erving was towards the end of his prime, but at the beginning of the 80s, he was still a human highlight reel. Alright, throughout the 80s, you also had Duncan Robinson. Fuck, why can't I say people's names? Dominique Wilkins being a human highlight reel. There's a good video by somebody who I can't think of right now, who goes into why Dominique Wilkins absolutely should have been in the NBA's first top 50 players of all time. And if he's not in the next one, that is blasphemy. Dude is absolutely a top 75 player of all time right now, and he should have been in the first top 50. Completely ridiculous player, arguably the best dunker in NBA history. Mid-80s, you get Michael Jordan showing up, and he's more of a 90s guy, but even in the 80s, he was fucking incredible, okay? His MVP in 88, where he won Defensive Player of the Year with it. Hakeem Olajuwon in the Rockets in the mid-80s, where him and Ralph Sampson went against the Celtics in 86. And they could have won against a lesser team, but that 86 team is arguably the best team ever, and also definitely one of the best post teams ever, having Larry Bird at the small forward, having Robert Parrish at center, who is a very good center, although slightly overrated in some ways by Celtics fans, but I digress, and having Kevin McHale at power forward. Kevin McHale, also one of the most underrated players of all time, very similar to Moses Malone. Kevin McHale, in my opinion, is the most underrated power forward of all time, and also the 6th greatest as of right now. Dude was ridiculous. There was so much talent in the 80s. It just exploded in there, okay? However, it wasn't a perfect decade. It was not the greatest decade in NBA history, in my opinion, and let me get into why. There's one main reason, and it's that despite having all this talent, it was congregated into several super teams, specifically the Celtics and the Lakers. And I said earlier that that is fantastic for the casual fan, and it is. It was huge for the NBA's popularity, and I would not change anything with how it was, because it was incredible for the NBA's development into a juggernaut. Okay? It was very, very important for this sport to become as popular as it was, and that was very much thanks to the super teams, especially the Showtime Lakers. However, as a fan of competitive basketball, the Lakers made 9 finals appearances in this decade. The Celtics made 5 of them. They won 8 of the 10 titles in this decade. Okay? That's not great. The Pistons won 1, and the Sixers won 1 of them. That is not great for competition. It's not great for, what is the word I'm looking for? It's not great for entertainment value for the average, not the average, for the hardcore fan, okay? As a hardcore fan, you don't want to see the Warriors go into the finals 5 straight years. It's not entertaining knowing they're going to make it out every year. And I assume in the 80s it was the same way. You don't want to see the Lakers going every single year. Come on, 9 straight years? 9 out of the 10 years. The only year the Lakers did not make the finals in the 80s was 86. That's not true. The only year they didn't make the finals in the 80s is 86 and 82, I think. I think that's accurate. I believe they made 9 finals total, not 9 in the 80s. So they made 8 finals in the 80s. 8 finals in the 80s for the Lakers. I've been saying that wrong this whole video. I apologize. But I digress. That is not great for entertainment value, okay? The West in the 80s was pathetically weak. You had a few years of the Rockets being real good, but for most of the 80s, you knew the Lakers were making it out of there because their team was stacked as fuck with 3 legit superstars in Magic, Worthy, and Kareem, plus a lot of supporting pieces. Now, Worthy wasn't in his prime until later in the 80s, and Kareem was going out of his prime when he came in, but nevertheless, okay, throughout the decade, 3 different superstar players, and Magic was a constant. That's just not entertaining, okay? That's a whole decade of the Warriors being on that team. That's just not that entertaining. And the Celtics in the East, pretty much the same issue until later when Larry Bird started getting hurt. Sorry about that. Until the late 80s when Bird started getting hurt. That's when the Pistons were finally able to overtake them. But for the most part, like, they were the same deal, okay? The East just wasn't that strong. It wasn't a strong league. And a lot of that issue is because of the 70s, which when the NBA was still very weak as a whole. And these super teams just kind of hurt the decade for me. That is the biggest issue in my opinion. The super teams really hurt the decade, and they really just really hurt the entertainment value. Okay? If I was a fan at the time, I would be pretty unhappy knowing that the Lakers were pretty much guaranteed to make the finals every single season. That's just not fun. So because of that, the 80s are not the greatest decade in NBA history. However, still an incredible decade, still an incredible amount of talent. The superstars of that decade would absolutely hold up in today's game, okay? For the most part, even more than the 60s, because 20 years later. And it's all uphill from here. Honestly, I think every decade since the 80s has been better than the 80s. But that's not to say the decade was not fantastic. And anyone who lived through it, I think that's got to be an amazing time for basketball. Alright, I really wish I had seen some stuff from the 80s live. So yeah, the 80s is not the greatest decade in NBA history, but it's pretty damn good. If you enjoyed this video and would be willing to like and subscribe, I would really appreciate that. Check out the video about the 60s if you have not already, and the video about the 90s will be coming soon. Thank you.